Vermeer rather tries to run away from this problem. In his later book, he writes this. I wonder what you think about this. Okay, he says, Skopos theory is meant to be a functional, theoretical, general theory covering process, product, and, as the name says, function, both of production and reception. As a functional theory, it does not strictly distinguish between descriptive and didactic prescription. That's not grammatically quite perfect at the end, but never mind. That's the way he wrote it. I find the argument very strange. I really don't understand that point of view. He seems to be saying, because it's a functional theory, we don't need to distinguish between prescriptive and descriptive. I can't see how that works. It seems to me that, to take an example, if you have a functional theory, which is concerned, for example, also with reception, you could say that I will now begin to analyze the reception of this translation, okay? How it functions in the target culture. And I will go and interview people, or I will do whatever reception analysis I decide to do, and I will see what it is. I will see how it has been received. I will describe the function, I will describe the reception of the translation in this culture. Now, to me, that's being descriptive. I say nothing about what it should be. I say nothing about whether it has succeeded or failed in fulfilling its Skopos. Necessarily, I could say that, but I don't here. I could be entirely prescriptive. And indeed, in another place, Vermeer himself seems to come somehow towards this point of view, where he says that if you translate in such and such a way, then Y will happen. A particular something will follow. It seems to me that that would be one way of connecting prescriptivism and descriptivism. If I say, translate like this, because if you don't, the client will not be pleased, or the reader won't understand, or the reader will press the wrong button or something, then you are simply defining a desired or undesired result of translating in a certain way. And you are describing what will happen if you do this and this. That's descriptive. So you could say that we can make prescriptive statements sound like descriptive ones if we formulate them as if statements like this. It's a kind of predictive hypothesis. Translate like this because if you don't, nasty things will happen. Okay? I mean, first of all, it sounds prescriptive, but if I say, I know that, or I claim that, if you do not translate like this, nasty things will happen, or if you do translate like this, then good things will happen, then you're making a predictive hypothesis, which you can test in quite a standard way. If this is what he means by saying that you can explain prescriptively, by saying that you can explain or that you can formulate prescriptive statements in a descriptive fashion, then I would agree. And perhaps that is what he's saying. Do you read this in the same way, Anthony, or not? I found this quotation very puzzling.
The second is fine, the first is incomprehensible.
Well, anyway. I think it is in fact, clearly a prescriptive theory, actually, because constantly Vermeer and Reis and Nord are describing the conditions and processes of what a translation should be like. Somewhere I asked Vermeer in an interview once how he would reply to this question, and in the interview, which is given in the references there, that's Chesterman 2001, he does acknowledge that the theory seeks to describe optimal cases. And I thought it would be rude of me then in the interview to pursue that point. But notice that that's quite interesting and quite revealing. Vermeer wrote, or he said, the theory attempts to describe optimal cases. So describe. It sounds like being descriptive. But then only optimal cases. So one wonders what happens to all the non-optimal ones? Are they simply not described by the theory? And if the non-optimal ones are not described by the theory, then the theory cannot be a general theory of all translation, because it would exclude all the non-optimal translations. It would exclude, for example, all bad translations. You may have seen a bad translation or two in your life, right? They do exist here and there. Even in Spain, you may find occasionally the odd bad translation. According to Vermeer, it would not be covered by Skopos theory, because Skopos theory only sets out to deal with the optimal ones. Surely that's a weakness in a theory that claims to be a general theory. What about the empirical status of the theory? You may remember the definition of the theory, which was given at the beginning by Vermeer and Weiss, that we start with observational data and then we make links and so on. It is a very curious fact that almost all the examples in the book are invented examples. There are very few real-life examples. So there are no empirical facts which have not been simply invented to illustrate a point. That goes very much against what they thought a theory ought to be. I'll discuss this under two headings. To what extent does the theory meet the criteria of descriptive adequacy, and to what extent does it meet the criteria of explanatory adequacy? I think any empirical theory should aim to describe as well as possible and perhaps also explain as well as possible. Skopos theory tries to do both. How well do you think it succeeds? The idea of reversibility that we started off. You remember one of the axioms was that translations are not uniquely reversible. Is that true, that axiom? Could one find counter examples? I think it would be very easy to find counter examples. The smaller the text, the shorter the text, the easier it would be. If I translate water as aqua, and then I look at aqua, and I say, I wonder what aqua is in Finnish, in English. And it's probably going to be water. That's reversible. Okay, and it's a notice saying water. And you translate it as aqua, and then from aqua it goes back to water. That's clearly obvious. Think of terminologists working, giving names in different languages for different technical tools, certain sorts of wheels or screwdrivers or whatever they might be. They must clearly be reversible. Think of phrases. I love you, and all the languages that it translates into, and then you go from them back into English. Do you get I love you or not? Well, yes, you probably do. Many things are clearly, they are reversible. So it's easy to find counter evidence to a claim that sets out to say translations cannot be reversible without specifying the length of the text that you're referring to, the length of translations that you're referring to. Translations don't have to be a book long or a sentence long. They can be much shorter. What about target-orientedness? The claim of the theory is that translators are always oriented towards the needs of the target audience. The Skopos is the intended effect on the target audience, and so on. Suppose we found translations which did not seem to be at all oriented towards the target audience, but oriented towards the source audience. Would that not falsify that descriptive claim? there are many such texts, and many have been studied. One of the most influential examples to me has been some of the work of Kaisa Koskinen. It's on your list there as well, K-O-S-K, Koskinen. When she studied EU translation, she pointed out that many of the texts translated in the EU are not translated for the needs of the target language audience at all. They are translated for the needs of the EU institution, which is producing the text in the first place. Okay? They need to be produced in all the languages of the EU because certain texts need to be translated in all the languages of the EU. Nobody may ever read them. Nevertheless, they need to be produced in all these languages. So it's not the case that there must necessarily always be target-orientedness. There's still a Skopos, certainly. The Skopos is the need of the institution, but the Skopos is not the target language audience, it's the source language audience. And there must be many others like that. Why, for example, did English poets in the 17th and 18th century often translate Greek and Latin poetry into English? Who would it be read by? It would be read by English scholars who already knew Latin and Greek. The needs are not the needs of the target audience. They're the needs of the writer to show what you can do, the translator to show what you can do in English. Show how English can match these Greek and Latin poems, and so on and so on and so on. So the target audience is not always the main thing. Well, that's the point which I was just referring to, okay? Koskinen and others argue against that. The theory also assumes that it's the translator's expertise that counts. The theory says over and over again, the book and the books, that the translator is an expert, is a communication expert, and he knows what to do, and so on. But as soon as you find situations where the translator's expertise is overruled by somebody else's expertise, that goes against the descriptive claim of the theory. It's not the case that the translator always has the final word. You can see examples from different areas. I give you three briefly. Nordman's doctorate in Finland showed that the lawyers often had the final word over the translation, over the translators, in translations of Finnish laws between Finnish and Swedish. It's a bilingual country, so all the laws are in Finnish and in Swedish. But the translator's word is not final. Lawyers have higher authority. Flynn, in another work, showed that this is now translating Irish poetry. And he showed that it was not always the translators of Irish poetry who had the final word. It was the publisher, who often decided, or the proofreader even, in some cases, whose opinion weighed more heavily than the opinion of the translator. It's simply counter-evidence. Remember I talked about counter-evidence the other day, so how important it is to look for counter-evidence. Julia Andreotti, in a wonderful research project being done partly here for Tarragona, is trying to show that in the Californian courts, interpreters who wish to interpret in a way that their clients, the accused, will understand, will need to make the register of their interpretation less formal, because the clients don't understand the very formal legal register. Their whole training says, adapt the language of the interpretation to what the client can understand. That's what Skopos theory would say. Can they do this? No, because the law of California says you must not change the register. If the judge speaks in a formal legal register, then your interpretation must be in a formal legal register, even though the client doesn't understand. So Skopos theory would say, well, the conditions are not optimal. This is not optimal translation, because the translator is working under duress. He's working under pressure. He's being told to do something, forced to do something that he knows he doesn't want to do. And in such conditions, Skopos theory doesn't apply. And I think that's a bit like cheating. It's like saying my theory only applies in the cases where it applies, and it doesn't apply in the cases where it doesn't apply. That's a bit circular, right? And it certainly doesn't apply generally if it rules out cases of translation under stress, or indeed under time pressure. If you put translators under time pressure, this was done in a nice experiment by Hansen, one of the things that happens is that they forget all about the Skopos. I remember Anthony drawing this to my attention some time ago. It's a very nice counterexample of the Skopos theory. If you make translators translate in a big hurry, they simply keep to the surface of the text. They haven't got time to worry about the Skopos, adapting things to the audience. They translate as literally as they can, as fast as they can. So is that then ruled out also by Skopos theory? So to summarize this page, this slide, claims are made which appear to be general claims by the theory, to which it seems to be relatively easy to find counter evidence. So they cannot be so generally valid. There need to be reservations. What about explanation? Skopos theory argues that the most important explanation, the most important cause of a translation is its Skopos. Well, you could say that it prioritizes the teleological cause in that case, one of Aristotle's 4 causes that both Anthony and myself have written about at different places. But what about all the other causes? There are other reasons, other factors which affect what a translator can do, not just the purpose of the translation. The structure of the target language, the structure of the source text, what the grammar will allow you to do, your mood at the time, your emotions, whether you've had coffee or not that morning. All these things can have a causal influence. What the norms are of translation in the target language. Skopos theory doesn't have much to say about norms. There are many other ways of explaining translation. Maybe if you really want to explain it, we have to look at as many causal factors as we can, not just assume that Skopos is always the most important one. It would be an interesting research question to explore when the Skopos was more important than other factors and when it was less important than other factors. But to assume that one cause of all possible causes is always the important one is probably counterintuitive. I wonder what consequences there might be, what testable consequences the theory might have. It's curious that very few hypotheses have emerged from this theory. It's not been productive. People have not found it an inspiring way of developing hypotheses. And I wonder why. I think one reason would be that they're all a bit obvious. Here is a hypothesis, for example, that if the Skopoi are different, then the translations will be different. You would assume, right? That could be derived from Skopos theory. And indeed there was a doctorate in Sweden which argued this and showed this. Well, it's not really very surprising, is it? It's pretty obvious. What about this one? If a translation is judged to be bad, the main reason, or a reason, will be that it does not meet the Skopos. You could derive that hypothesis from the theory. Big deal. So, I mean, that's not really very exciting, is it, either? This might be more interesting. I think that nobody has studied this, as far as I know, that the type of Skopos correlates more closely with the type of equivalence than the source text type. If that turned out to be supported, that would suggest that in those cases the Skopos was more important than the source text in determining what the translator decided to do. But that's not been studied as far as I know. One reason might be that we have no typology of Skopoi, which I think is surprising. We have no accepted typology of the central concept of the theory remains undifferentiated. There have been some attempts to make classifications, but in fact they turn out to be classifications of translations, translation types, not Skopos types. And in fact the only translation of Skopoi, or one of the few that I've ever met, doesn't come from Skopos theory at all. It comes from the practice of translation in the EU, which is the reference here from Wagner. This is our book, Can Theory Help Translators, when she gave these 5 basic Skopoi types. She didn't call them Skopoi. She says these are what we call different purposes of translation in the EU. This is how we classify texts. And this is what we tell readers, tell translators. You need to translate bearing in mind this particular Skopos. But as far as I know, nobody has tried to explore connections between different Skopoi, different Skopos types, and different sorts of solutions that a translation might follow, and in any detail, because we really don't have an accepted classification of Skopos types. And what about ethics, I wonder? When Nord wrote her book about Skopos theory, okay, translation as a purposeful activity, you've probably read it or seen it, okay? She introduced the concept of loyalty into the theory, and because she wanted a way of partly giving more weight to the source text, and partly a way of bringing in something ethical. Vermeer didn't like this at all. He rejected this entirely, this new addition to the theory, because he argued this against it. He argued that ethics must not be mixed up with general theoretical considerations about other subjects. Science should be value-free. I wonder if you would agree with that. The one question would be, can science be value-free? Is it value-free? And then, can a translation theory be value-free? And I think many people would argue that Vermeer's claim is not really supportable. For example, there is a classic paper by Rudner, which I give in the references, and I would refer you to it if you find this interesting. A classic paper in philosophy, way back 50, 60 years ago, which shows fairly convincingly, I think, that science can in fact never be value-free, because even the decision to try to be objective is a value judgment. I find that argument quite good. Sorry, I find that argument quite good. And certainly, if you're having a theory of translation, particularly a theory which is based in action theory, where you have actors making decisions, rational or not, then to say that actors make decisions with no regard to any kind of ethical considerations seems to me to make not much sense. It makes all translators sound like Machiavelli, or something of that sort. And so I find that Vermeer's rejection of an ethical dimension, I find that I disagree with that. I find it's not supported. Strangely enough, this is one of the points on which Gideon Toury agrees with Vermeer. He also seems to want to keep ethics out of translation studies. With him also I disagree on that topic. Quite curious. I wonder what you think about that. Maybe we have different views of what the theory ought to be. Mona Baker certainly assumes that ethics must play a part. And she argues in an interesting and rather emotional interview that I had with her, which is in the references there too. She argues in part of that interview that Skopos theory actually embodies a certain sort of ethics. it's the same kind of argument as we saw before with the metaphors. She says, underlying Skopos theory, there is a certain ethical or even non-ethical view of translation. I wonder if you would agree with this. I won't read it aloud because you can, or should I read it for the other viewers? Perhaps I should. This is Baker describing the way in which she sees Skopos theory, which she does not like at all, as you can imagine. She writes, we soon we see Skopos theory as a narrative in our minds. Okay? The theory evokes, for me at any rate, an industrialized, affluent society populated by clients and highly professional translators who belong to the same world as their clients, who are focused on professionalism and making a good living, and who are highly trained, confident young men and women. These professional translators and interpreters go about their work in a conflict-free environment and live happily ever after. They do not get thrown into Guantanamo or shot at in Iraq, and they do not end up on the border of Kosovo and Albania in the middle of a nasty war where they would have to decide whether or not to fulfill their commission at the expense of treating potential victims with compassion and respect. It's an emotional argument. So she's claiming that the kind of ethics inside Skopos theory is a kind of cold, robotic, mechanical kind of ethics underlying the system. The translator, the expert, will do whatever is necessary to fulfill the goal, to meet the goal. Any means is good enough to reach the end. Okay? The theory does not ask whether the end to be reached is a good end or not. Notice, there is no place in the theory to ask, is the Skopos a good Skopos? Or should I just not translate because this Skopos is something that I find evil? The theory doesn't have any space in which you can make that question. Because the assumption is the Skopos is given, you do what it takes to meet the Skopos. It's mechanical. And for some scholars, such as Mona Baker, this is repugnant, this is anti-human, it's anti-humanistic. It's a curious, it claims to be ethics-free, but in fact it's unethical. I think that some people would argue that. Just a couple of things more, because you must be wanting to say your own say. I'll be about 5 minutes and then we can have some time for discussion. I'd like to say something about the competition, because one of the ways in which one assesses any theory is to compare it to its competitors. Now, the closest competitor to Skopos theory is the theory of translational action by Holtz-Mann-Perry. The reference is there on your list. But this is so close that many people have argued that it's really the same kind of theory in different terminology. And indeed, they did work very closely together, Vermeer and Holtz-Mann-Perry. And I think they would accept that their two books, their two versions, are really variants of the same idea in different terminology and different structures likely. But it's basically very similar. So we don't look there to find an interesting comparison. I think that one of the interesting places to look is relevance theory. One of the questions I asked Vermeer when I interviewed him some years ago was how he saw the relation between Skopos theory and relevance theory. And he said, Skopos theory is the general theory, and relevance theory deals with a small sub-part of Skopos theory. In another circumstance, I interviewed Gut, whom I also met, and I asked him the same question. How do you see the relation between relevance theory and Skopos theory? And Gut's answer was, relevance theory is the main big theory, and Skopos theory deals with a small corner of relevance theory. I thought that was quite interesting, because it shows something very human about scholars. Possibly it also shows something about irrationality, I wonder. It depends on how you define rationality, all right? But still, there are some interesting differences between the two. So, relevance theory seems to rule out very free translations. what I would call very free translations, multilingual descriptions, the things you find on your washing machine instructions in 9 languages. Good would say these are not translations in the real sense of the word, these are something different. He tries to exclude them from his approach. He has a rather narrower view than Skopos' theory. So for Vermeer, that would be an example of a very clear Skopos, translate as freely as you like, but make sure that the reader can understand the instructions about the washing machine. Reorganize the text as you will. Relevance theory would say, I don't think we want to deal with those. Then there is a strange similarity, because where Skopos theory talks about an offer of information, which is assumed by the community, I've rather mistyped that, haven't I? It's assumed by the communicator to be assumed as interesting. That's a bit of a mess, that bit, sorry. To be assumable as interesting. Okay, that's something gone wrong there. The idea is that your offer is assumed, you think your offer will be interesting to the receiver, and that's why you offer it. Now this is very close actually to the maximum cost efficiency effect of relevance theory. You speak in a way which will make your message maximally relevant to the hearer. So it's like they're saying the same kind of thing, actually. Both theories assume rationality, which you could say is a weakness. I suppose it depends on your view of human nature a bit there. Kant probably disagree. Or would he agree? Perhaps he would agree in assuming rationality.
Absolutely.
He would have to, wouldn't he? He would agree, yes. He would agree there. And relevance theory seems to exclude a change of Skopos, which Skopos theory would certainly accept. So it seems to me that they're both actually, they overlap, I think. Quite, if you look at this in more detail, which I haven't got time to do now, but if you compare the two theories' claims in more detail, you would find a lot of similarities and some areas of clear difference. Because although relevance theory is not set out as an axiomatic theory, it does have a number of basic principles upon which other things followed, which are not actually called axioms, I think, in relevance theory, but they work in the same way as axioms do. So they're not perhaps so different, but one can see that the two pioneers, Gut and Vermeer, are both rather wary of each other because they can see that they are actually attempting to cover some similar ground from a different angle. So, conclusions. I take it to be a prescriptive theory. I take it to be pedagogically valuable. In fact, I can't imagine teaching translation without using the idea of Skopos, if not the word. I might use the word purpose, or what's the translation for, or something like that, but I can't imagine teaching any translation course without involving some concept of Skopos or purpose or intention. I don't know how I would do that. But then that's not really very new. I don't imagine anybody has ever taught translation without some concept of purpose. So it's useful, but is that new? I think it's certainly weak as a descriptive and explanatory theory. Many of its descriptive claims leave themselves open to counter-evidence. It offers one explanation, but overlooks many others, which suggests that it's less empirical, actually, less empirically adequate than it would like to be. And it's not been very productive. If you compare the number of hypotheses that have grown out of it to the number of hypotheses that have grown out of, for example, polysystem theory, the difference is enormous. Polysystem theory has been infinitely more productive in terms of generating ideas, generating claims and hypotheses. It's a much richer, much more productive theory. However, on the positive side, it certainly helped to shift the whole focus of translation studies away from equivalence onto target, onto the audience, onto sociological factors like decision making, agents and reception and other agents involved and so on. And in this respect, it's been among many other functional approaches to translation. So in the old days, you could say that the source text was sitting on the throne, ruling, and now what Skopos theory and some others have done is to take the source text off the throne and replace that by the Skopos. So Skopos is now sitting on the throne and dominating the picture in their view. And for me, it has certainly made me stop to think what I mean by a theory. It's made me wonder about different kinds of theory. We have today been talking about an axiomatic kind of theory, which is not very typical in translation studies, as I think. So it makes me wonder about kinds of theory and about what we mean by theory, partly because its own view of theory seems to be, to some extent, in conflict with its own way of developing its claims. And I suppose one wonders, you could say, has Skopos theory fulfilled its own Skopos? I perhaps won't answer that question, but I could leave it hanging in the air, and we have anyway 20 minutes or so that we could perhaps helpfully and usefully use for questions and comments and disagreements and discussion. You must all feel like moving for a minute, so you might all like to stand up and wave your arms about, and let's open the doors or the windows and
or should we have a quick discussion?
Quick discussion and then start?
We'll go and have a drink.
We could do that. That also might be a good solution. But does this raise any questions that you'd like to bring up? Does it give you any suggestions about how you might also critically assess theories and claims that you also are working with, which might be with theories which are quite different?
Andrew, I'm wondering, despite the criticism that...
Well, wait, can you come up here and speak through there?
Yeah.
So the world can hear you. We've got about 27, we had 27 people listening to us. Listening to you, Adam.
Well, I was saying that despite the criticism that the theory received, and you mentioned some of them here, are we supposed to use the theory now or not? We should stop using the theory, or we should stop thinking about the theory, because it doesn't seems to be that much current in translation studies. As we say, we have functional theories, we can use that, or we can function. Why we use that? Or I think Anthony said in his that philosophy that why we should use this if we can use some more simple terms. What do you suggest to the translation studies students? Should we use that term, or what should we do with the text? It has the problems, okay, but it has its potential, yes. It has the weakness, of course. But what should we supposed to do? I mean,
in a research project,
yeah,
you need theoretical instruments, theoretical tools to propose, to formulate research questions and to analyze data and to formulate arguments and so on and so on. If you find a particular theory or approach gives you useful tools, why not use them? But you can use them critically, you can adapt the tools, you can adopt certain parts of the theory because they allow you to conceptualize certain issues clearly that you want to discuss, which are useful to you. And you might even be able to combine certain bits of this theory with certain bits of that theory. There are always risks involved in combining different theories, but sometimes they can lead to quite new insights. So the question, should we use this theory, cannot be answered in the abstract, I don't think. All theories, I suppose, almost by definition, are imperfect, because theories are not truths. Theories are conceptual structures which hopefully are useful in describing or explaining something. And if you find a particular conceptual structure useful, use it. If you want to use it and modify it, do so. If you think it's not useful and some other one is better, don't use it. If you're going to build a house, and you say, and I say, here is a good hammer, but use my hammer to build your house. It will help you. And you look at my hammer and you think, that's a pretty pathetic hammer, I don't think I'm going to use that. My dad's got a much better hammer than you. Then you wouldn't use my hammer, would you? Even though somebody might come along and say, this is a really useful hammer, you ought to use this one. You would probably say, why is it a good hammer? Why is this hammer that I'm offering you better than my dad's hammer, which actually is bigger and easier to use? So if you choose a conceptual tool to work with, and I take a theory to be a conceptual tool, leading us, we use theories to try to improve our understanding. If you say that the goal of all academic scientific endeavour is somehow to understand something better, okay? A theory is a way of trying to understand something better. And if it's useful, then try it. But it's not a fact. It's not theories are not true or false. Theories are, they're usually, well, I should say that theories are usually proved wrong, aren't they? I was reading the other week in the New Yorker, 3 or 4 weeks ago, there was an article which was quite interesting, claiming that repeating the old idea that every single scientific theory that now exists in the world is probably wrong. I.e. not completely right. More or less right, maybe, not completely. But do you think that a theory should be necessarily something which is right and therefore must be used?
This is getting depressing, Andrew.
Because go on then.
I have a comment from the online chat room. We have a question from the chat room.
Okay.
Thank you, Ismail. I've got lots of comments. I'll just read out here. Shari says, not a question, just an observation. Skopos theory, as taught to me by Christina Scheffner, has helped me educate my clients.
Nice point.
Yes, and make them accept less literal translations. Michelle totally agrees.
Yeah, very good point. Very good point.
So that's progress.
That's progress.
Things.
And why does it help you educate clients? Because it gives you something which sounds terminologically scientific. The client says, what do you translate this sentence like this for? And you, the translator, you say, well, it's because of the Skopos. Don't you know? And the client says, huh? What do you mean? And then you can put on your academic hat and you can use a term, a useful term, to justify a claim, justify your decision. That's great. It's a very good comment.
Yeah, and I think that has been a sense of progress.
Yes.
As I said in my lectures here, it's made the theatre of the theories bigger.
Yes.
We've seen more things, and we can talk about clients, and that's been very valuable.
And I made that point. I think it certainly it gives sociological breadth. It's one of the early ways of broadening out away from just looking at. I agree entirely with whoever that was.
Mikako, who is in Monterey, asks, more or less, if you follow a norm, isn't that a Skopos? And if you're keeping within time limitation, isn't that a Skopos? You seem to assume that Skopos, the purpose, is only what the clients want and what the clients say.
Yes, the Skopos is supposed to be, it's in the theory, it's supposed to be a property of the translation has a Skopos. The client starts off by saying, here is this text, translate it, and this is the Skopos that I wanted to have. At least your ideal client will tell you why you are translating this. And the translator is supposed to accept, in the theory, is supposed to accept or negotiate the definition of the Skopos. And if the translator says, fine, yes, that's a reasonable Skopos for this text, I would so translate it according to that Skopos. But the time limit has nothing to do with the Skopos.
No, but Vermeer then qualifies as, and in the last analysis, the Skopos is defined from the translator's point of view.
The translator has to accept the Skopos.
No, one can modify it, and what the Skopos is the translator's decision.
Ultimately, yes, but it's not the property of the translator, of the translator, it's a property of the text.
I don't know, I see it as a property of the action.
Maybe I think this is defined slightly differently at different places and by different scholars within the theory.
Yeah.
But even if you say it's a property of the action, you could say that it's a Skopos of the translation act to finish it by next Thursday, but it's not a Skopos of the text, which is defined with respect to its desired effect on the reader. So at least I see it like that. But maybe there's some bits that I haven't noticed.
No, I remember picking up a text where Vermeer goes through this, and it's this phrase, als der Sichtstätte des Translators, it's in the final analysis that the translator decides what
yes,
the Skopos
but
is. If you stick with that, then you can see, I want to make some money quickly. That's a Skopos.
But if the client says, for example, here is 1,000 pages, and it's got to be translated in such a way by tomorrow morning, and the translator is within his rights to say, no, I cannot do that. I can give you I'll give you a gist translation, if you like. I'll give you a rough idea what's in this text, but I cannot possibly translate it the way you want by tomorrow morning. So I reject your Skopos within that time frame.
Sure.
Is that what this person means, I wonder, by saying that it's part of the time?
I don't know, but I sort of agree with her. I do see Skopos as being a broader thing, not just limited to clients' wishes or impositions. Making quick money is a Skopos, why not? Why did you...
Do you mean it's a translator's Skopos?
It's an Skopos of an action.
No,
actions make money and they work quickly. Translators make money and they work quickly.
The Skopos of the translation is not to make money for the translator. I don't think that's what Vermeer means. That's not my reading of Vermeer.
Esra says, I believe that Skopos, we'll come to you in a minute, in the interpreting context, sometimes becomes very concrete and thus very useful. Just saying that.
Yeah, the idea of thinking about the purpose. Notice that I have never, I think at one point in this talk, suggested that the idea of thinking about the Skopos or thinking about the purpose is not useful. It seems to me to be perfectly obvious.
You don't need a theory for that.
Exactly. I mean, you don't need an axiomatic theory of this sort to say something so obvious.
Except that it wasn't said in the equivalence paradigm that preceded this.
I think that the benefit of the theory may have been that it dresses up in impressive academic costume a simple idea that had rather got forgotten by the academics, not by the teachers, certainly.
But do remember Eugene Levy's work and
yes,
discussion of decision mechanisms.
Yes, he certainly talks about effects, the intended effect, yes, when he weighs up the different choices.
Absolutely.
Yes, the idea is there. I mean, the idea is not new. I certainly would not claim that the idea is new. The term is new.
The shape, the structure of Eugene Levy's theories are more theoretical than this theory you just presented.
Yes, and it would have been actually quite a good example as another competitor, as it were. To what extent do Levy's does Levy's theory or Levy's
And
approach
Levy's
overlap with
work-
this one?
Levy's work is embedded in the Prague school tradition.
Yes, 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 I'm familiar with it. And it
It's
would have
not
been,
it's not something separate from that tradition.
I agree, yes, it would have been a good example to take as a competitor to evaluate in the same way. Yes, the
Seems
idea
to
of
be
the Skopos is not new. The term is new, but